Hi, I'm Brad and I'm going to give you my top 5 tips for keeping silvers coming this winter. So number one, probably one of the most important ones, is accuracy. So in the winter, fish really do slow down, they don't move around as much, they have less energy, and they're not sort of hunting out that feed quite so actively, so hence why bites tend to be a bit more timid, and that's why we don't feed as much as well. So a really big, important tip is being accurate as possible. So that includes sort of keeping an eye on far bank markers, so pick something to fish to, and keep it obvious so you don't forget where it is. So a nice easy one for me, I've got that tree behind me on the island, so I can't forget that because it's pretty much standing alone. You can remember where you are on your pole if you're pole fishing, so either use a joint or go to the end of your pole so you can't go too far wrong. And if you're on the rods, make sure you keep it clipped up. Make sure you feed really accurately and just keep everything nice and tight. It's particularly important in the winter when bites are harder to come by. So tip number 2, following on from the accuracy, we're going to talk a little bit more about bait, and that's actually looking after your bait in the winter. Now, the weather conditions in the winter are normally pretty adverse. Like we normally have the rain, you can have like lots of wind, it's sort of moisture and sort of cold in the air. So looking after your bait is really important, and by that I mean keeping your maggots sort of fresh. So I always keep a little bag of maize flour. You can buy it in like the big bulk sacks online, and just keep it in the garage and just scoop it out every so often. The same stuff that they put on in the shop for you. But put a liberal helping on before you go fishing. It helps soften the maggots as well as a little added plus, but it keeps them nice and fresh, stops them from sweating, and they're definitely more attractive for the fish. And being on from that, make sure you keep them in a side tray with like a hood on, so if it does rain you can sort of cover them over, because once they get wet they get like superpowers and start escaping everywhere and crawling up walls. So you don't want that happening, it creates a mite mess, and they smell and just look horrible, so I can imagine the fish aren't too keen either. And same with things like your ground bait and your pellets, so keep them covered over, make sure that they don't get overly damp or wet, and just keep them in good condition. So a good tip there for the winter. So tip number 3, following on from the bait, is about being more refined. Now we've talked about feeding less and being accurate, and that sort of follows on to your tackle. So as we've said, the fish don't move around as much, so you need to be a bit more refined in the stuff that you use. So your floats, sort of your lines, your hooks and things, we just need to like sort of scale it all down a little bit and just keep it a bit more precise. So make sure that you dot your floats down nice and low, obviously so that you can see them, but sometimes you can make it hard work for yourselves, and with the low sun in the winter your eyes can be absolutely knackered by the end of the day, so bear that in mind. But keep them nice and low because it does make quite a big difference. Think about the size of your floats as well. Try and use as light as a float as you can get away with in the depth of water and sort of the conditions on the day. Obviously you want to keep the presentation, which is always paramount. So use a big enough float that you get a good presentation, but light enough that the fish are going to bite, particularly if you're fishing for silvers. It does make a huge difference. With your line, sort of scale them all back, and with your hooks as well, use a nice fine wide hook, something like a Guru F1 maggots are good, or even the pellet ones if there's a few more bigger fish in there. They're slightly stronger than the maggot hooks, but still a really good winter hook. So tip number 4, and it's moving on to being a bit more organised. Now, obviously in the summer we try and be really efficient, so we're catching lots of fish. We can sort of, especially in matches, like land them as quick as possible and put a good weight together. And that means being efficient, being smooth, and sort of having everything around you. And the same applies in winter really, but for a slightly different reason. Obviously in winter we're not catching as much and the fish are a bit more spooky, so vibrations, sort of disturbance on the bank are probably going to make more difference. And obviously we just need to make sure that everything's around so we don't have to get up too much. So that includes things like make sure your rollers are set right before you start. Sometimes you have to jump up and things to get it. Make sure you've got your bait all around you. Make sure that you've got your backup stuff next to you, and sort of your rigs and your hook links and some spare floats and feeders. So ideally we don't want to be sort of getting up too much, because again that bankside disturbance, that skyline and the vibrations on the bank, I think in winter it sort of magnifies, the water's more clear, and I think the fish are quite wise to it, particularly like with silvers if you're on the river, and especially quite a famous one for being sort of spooky with it. So try and keep yourself organised. You'll be a bit warmer as well because you won't have to get up as much, and you keep yourself wrapped up and cozy, especially in the winter. So make sure that you keep yourself organised, have stuff to hand, and you won't have to get up as much, and hopefully it'll result in a few more fish in the net. So tip number 5, and a good one to finish on, is having lots of options covered. I feel like in the summer at times it can be a bit more predictable. You know, when the weather's warm and things, we're probably going to catch shallow, probably going to catch down the edge, probably only set a method feeder up as a bit of a chuck out as a last hoper type thing. Often it only goes in first chuck and then goes away for the rest of the match, whereas in the winter I feel like it can be less predictable. We're not quite sure the day's going to go. There's some days where the fish want to be up in the water despite the fact it's freezing cold. There's other days where they want to be right out in the middle of the lake. So it's really important to have those options covered. Today I've got sort of pole rigs for the same line. Some are light floats for fishing through the water. Some are heavier for that more positive approach that we want to nail a bait down in case there's some bream about. And then I've got wagglers and feeders set up too. So I've got lots of different things to sort of cover the options. Obviously Cooper's, as you can see behind me, it's a nice open water lake. It's very deep as well. and there's lots of places the fish could be hiding, and in the winter when it's harder, then we need to sort of plug away and work quite hard really. It's almost sort of have to move more in the winter at times, and it sometimes pays to be patient, but other times you do have to ring the changes, and the last thing you want is to not be organised and not have that there, because if it's not set up, then you know what it's like. We're probably not going to set it up halfway through the match. Very rarely we sort of get up and put that rig together, but if it's there to hand, you're more likely just to grab it. It takes 5 minutes to give it a quick go, and if it doesn't work, you can pop it back down. So set up plenty, have your options covered, and you should get a few more bites this winter.